Welcome to today's event, Feminism, an integral tool of Neocolonialism. It's a lecture by Professor Tommy Curry. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And thank you for coming all the way from Scotland to Austria to hold this lecture. Professor Curry joined the philosophy department at the University of Edinburgh in the fall of 2019. His research interests are in Africana philosophy and the Black radical tradition, and he specializes in 19th century ethnology, critical race theory, and Black male studies. He is the author of multiple books, including Another White Man's Burden, Josiah Royce's Quest for a Philosophy of Racial Empire, and The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood, published in 2017, which is something that we're going to be referring to today. So before we get to the lecture, just a quick technical note. We're going to have a Q&A session after, where you get to ask your questions, but I urge you to keep it short and to respect Professor Tommy Curry's time. He flew all the way here to hold his lecture, so some people tend to use the Q&A round for counter lectures. Please just respect the speaker's time. We're here to listen to him. And I think we're all looking forward to the lecture and you're probably going to be intrigued by what people have to ask or want to ask you.
Of course.
So, yes. Before we dive into the topic of today's lecture, it would be important to establish some facts about the political space of Austria that we're in, to help us all kind of calibrate before listening to the content, starting off with a much denied colonial history of this country. Austria has had slaves, it partook in slave trades and in the continent's cruel history of colonialism without ever owning significant amounts of land in the global south, and so it kind of rids itself of this reputation of being a colonial power. Also, closer to today, in the early 1990s, if you went into the renowned Museum of Natural History, you would find an African man on display among the stuffed whales and Bengal tigers. Later that decade, we witnessed one of the two largest police raids in the history of the Second Republic, so since World War II. The first one being the so-called Operation Spring, carried out in the years 1999 and 2000 against organized members of the African community in Austria. And then Operation Luxor in 2020 against organized Muslims in this country. Another thing to clarify is our critical approach. If we in Dar al Janub, for example, deal in a critical manner with the questionable role of the Communist Party or parties in Europe in relation to the liberation movements of the Global South, then it isn't a testimony to us being anti-communist, but it is an earnest attempt to work in and on history. And similarly, when we address and criticize the role of feminists, especially white feminists in the West, then it is not at all justification of patriarchal violence or power structures. We just demand academic and activist sincerity and seriousness from ourselves and from everyone. Now I'll let you take over the lecture.
No, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the invitation. There's a little bit of context here that I want to use to frame the presentation specifically about intersectionality. So in the 19th century, discussions of race and racism, enslavement and colonialism revolved around questions of the savagery of men. 19th century ethnology was fundamentally interested as a science of racial hierarchy. And in order to determine which race was at the top of civilization and which races were at the bottom of those to be ruled, the question of where men fell in that hierarchy was central. So in the 19th century, you have various debates going on among suffragettes about how savage black men actually were. Many suffragettes, for example, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, wrote articles like Manhood Suffrage that suggested that the best orders of men were Anglo-Saxon and that rule by any other savage group of men would lower the status of womanhood overall because savage men were not intelligent enough to rule over white women. Specifically, Phoebe Cousins wrote a short article on black men in 1887. And I just want you to hear what she has to say about it because I think it really does serve as a useful basis to contextualize what I'm going to say about intersectionality. So Phoebe Cousins writes in 1887 that she's had opportunities of seeing and knowing the condition of both sexes and will bear my testimony that the black women are and always have been in a far worse condition than the men. As a class, they are better and they're more intelligent than black men. Yet they've been subjected to greater brutalities, while compelled to perform the exact same labor as men toiling by their side in the fields. The black men as a class, are very tyrannical in their families. They have learned the lesson of brute force but too well, and as the marriage law allows the husband entire control over his wife's earnings and her children, she is in worse bondage than before, because in many cases, the task of providing for a helpless children and an idle, lazy husband is imposed on the patient wife and mother. And with this sudden elevation to citizenship, which the mass of stupid, ignorant Negroes took upon as entitling them to great honor, I regard the future state of the Negro woman without the ballot in her hand as deplorable, and what is said of the ignorant black man can be truthfully said of the ignorant white man. They regard all women as an inferior being, end quote. Now, the reason this quote is so important is because it suggests a few things. One, the view of black men as savage, bestial, and brute was solidified early in the night, or well into the late 1800s. The second issue is the way that families are described here. The notion of family violence, which is one of the central aspects of intersectionality, was articulated by a white female suffragist in 1887. This suggests that the way that we look at violence, domestic abuse, rape, the assumptions about patriarchy, etc., are not actually new analysis that we get in the 20th and 21st century, but these have been long solidified within the kind of trajectories that we've had of imperial feminism. Now, the previous research in imperial feminism, like Louise Newman's work, White Women's Rights, and Alison Schneider's book, Suffragists in Imperial Age, situate feminism well within the colonial sphere. That's not a new intervention anymore. The idea that feminism was white supremacist, that it supported imperialism, that it actually made certain diagnoses about the colonial state and the apparatus. In fact, my work shows that white women went to colonies to set up various proxemics or spaces, churches, schools, etc., to limit the movement of racialized people, specifically racialized men. Now, the reason that all this becomes important is because what we see in intersectionality is a reproduction of some of the essentialist notions around racialized men that I think are now taken to be progressive politics. So in the presentation that we'll begin now, we see a few things, and I want to talk about this specifically in relationship to the intersectional axiom. The first thing that we notice...
You have to click on for the first one, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so the first thing that we notice is that intersectionality doesn't really have a definition. So this means that it's extremely malleable to any kind of progressive situation that people think that it applies to. Now, people have suggested this is in fact the strength of intersectionality, this definitional dilemma. But what we see is that it's really an addition of post hoc and ad hoc analysis. It fits and claims whatever people of a certain political persuasion say that it does. And the reason that this is important is because when we look at the actual facts of the matter, issues of homicide, domestic violence, sexual assault in racialized communities, when we look at issues of conflict, be it international war, genocides, etc., then what we see are things that don't fit within the prediction of double jeopardy or the idea that women are always at the bottom of the totem pole. This is important because it provides a political lens that many people throughout the West use to highlight certain forms of violence in the in non-white communities while ignoring others. So we'll ignore, for instance, the high rates of homicide against black men. We'll focus then on sexual assault, constructing these men as threats that provide a kind of a backdoor rationalization for why we shouldn't be as supportive of black men as a group as we initially thought. So intersectionality then, next slide please. Intersectionality then has largely been defined as an attitude rather than an analytic system or methodology. It's a sensibility. It's generally how we feel about these things. So Sumi Cho, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Leslie McCall kind of make this argument, right, that says that it's best framed as an analytic sensibility. That if intersectionality is an analytic disposition, it's a way of thinking about and conducting analyses. But what's not talked about here, right, we were appreciating the fluidity of it, is what are the rounded concepts that it's actually utilizing. Next slide, please. So intersectionality, rather than being a method, is more of an axiom. And what I'd like to suggest to you is that as an axiom or value, it already has predetermined conclusions. It's not an open system of interpretation. Rather, it's when you look at any situation, no matter what it is, a war, a conflict, etc., you will always find that women are going to be oppressed more than their male counterparts. You're always going to arrive at an answer, even if men are disproportionately killed, that men have privilege in that situation. In fact, you'll have situations like BLM in the United States where you have black men that are overwhelmingly the victims of police violence compared to their female counterpart being said to oppress women in their death because they're taking attention away. So because it's an axiom or a presumably true statement that's unable to be proved or falsifiable, it offers rhetorical support for its conclusions, not empirical or material ones. This means that the justifications are both ad hoc, meaning they're created when needed to defend the established beliefs by intersectional feminist theories, and post hoc, meaning they're used to interpret events that have already transpired and subsequently claimed as an example of intersectionality. Next slide. So what ends up happening here is that we have an ideological core that's not been questioned in intersectional ideas. And this is the idea of dominance theory. Now, Catherine McKenna's dominance theory was a very essentialist claim. She assumed that women were victims of rape and men biologically, culturally, were disposed to rape. So in situating this argument, she was suggesting to us that we understand female subjugation purely in relationship to male dominance. Right? So patriarchy then becomes the essential law and symbol of what we understand the male to be. Now, this means that this creates kind of a baseline for our interpretation. There's not a lot of wiggle room here. How we think of intersectional analysis already has to have a male perpetrator because that is a necessary condition for how we understand female vulnerability. Next slide, please. So even in recent scholarship, Devin Carbato and Cheryl Harris have kind of given support to this interpretation. When I initially wrote the Mad Nod saying that intersectionality was an essentialist theory that required male perpetration to situate female vulnerability, people wanted to say it was a misreading of intersectionality. Surprise, surprise, 2 years later, Devin Carbato and Cheryl Harris write Intersectionality at 30, where they actually talk about the fact that intersectionality is an essentialist analytic that is fundamentally incompatible with Catherine McKinnon's dominance theory. Now, anybody who's read Crenshaw would understand that, but we haven't really begun to think about the implication of this kind of concession. If you start with the view that men are necessarily oppressors, and remember, based on dominance theory, violent, they are driven and defined by their ability to situate and commit violence against women, then how does that become a liberatory framework for any other group of people within black races, minority races, communities of color, besides for women? It means that every account for violence has to have male power or patriarchy at its core. And what I'm going to show you is that that's in fact out of line with the empirical evidence, and it's being used as an ideological justification for colonial interventions throughout history. Next slide, please. So throughout Europe, this kind of history is disowned. So there's a deracialization of intersectional theory that doesn't allow European scholars and thinkers to really confront what's going on in terms of the racial politics and assumption of how intersectionality works. So intersectionality, when I came to the European context, was said just to be the interaction of different identities and categories. You can be ableist, you can be tall, you can be white, you can be Jewish, you can be da-da-da. And these are supposed to be neutral intersections. Now, when we actually go through mapping the margins by Kimberly Crenshaw, we find something that's a lot different than that. We see a centering of black women's experiences, and we see an understanding of black women's experiences of violence at the hands of black men to be situated largely in criminological theories that are saying that black men are trying to compensate for their masculinity. Now, we have to think about this seriously. That means that our progressive politics that are surrounding the issue of gender and talking about the analysis that we have in communities of color are not really trying to study violence in communities of color. They're coming at pre-arrived answers. Said differently, intersectionality is a way to import pathological or criminological theories about racialized men under the guise of a liberal politic. It's pretending to be a fluid and sensible way of thinking about the world, but those ways of thinking about the world come to the very same conclusion that we find throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Next slide. So this brings us to a discussion of subcultural violence theory. Now, subcultural violence theory was a criminological theory that was extremely popular in the mid-20th century. And it's something that's been imported, or I should say exported, across the world as the basis of understanding why racialized poor groups act violently towards one another. This was a big debate in the 1970s and 80s. It forms the context, or really the pretext, that Kimberly Crenshaw is reacting to in Mapping the Margins when she's discussing domestic violence in the Black community. And it's also something that I'll show you in a second was picked up by white feminism as the basis of understanding the perpetration of both domestic violence and rape. Next slide. So subcultural violence theory is basically the argument that there's a potential theme of violence in a current cluster of values that make up the lifestyle, the socialization process, and the interpersonal relationships of individuals that live in similar conditions. Next slide. So under these ideas by criminologists like Wolfgang and Ferracuti, who created this theory, racial differences became much more important indicators of violence than gender differences. Now what this means is that when you looked at a group, in the white group, you usually have men be more aggressive than women. So the idea was that in the white group, gender tells you something about the rates of perpetration. You see this also in Toulmin's work on compulsive masculinity in the 1950s. We have to understand that the way that we study masculinity, and not only white masculinity, but every other racial and ethnic variant of masculinity, is based on the idea of pathologizing poor whites. So what Toulmin wanted to understand in the 1950s was, well, what happens when you have groups of men and boys that can't become educated and middle class? What do? He argued that they have a compulsive attitude, that they use aggression, that they use machismo to compensate for what they can't get through the material world. Now, of course, you can see how this sounds very much like much of the assumptions, or a lot of the assumptions we have today in gender theory. But that idea set in focus, or brought focus to how many sociologists throughout the 1920s and 30s, the mid-1900s, were trying to interpret other racialized groups. Because poor white men were thought to be deviants, reacting to what they couldn't get from educated middle-class white men, you then had them apply this very same term to every other racial variety. So you had culture of poverty theory, which suggests that if you look at Latino cultures, that you find hyper-masculine men who are stuck in cycles of poverty that can't get any education, they can't get jobs, so they compensate. You see this in relationship to black men, which is what Wolfgang and Ferracuti is doing. Saying, well, look, this compulsive masculinity is compensatory when you talk about Negro masculinity. Because you can't get jobs, you can't get educated, you're going to use violence and aggression specifically as a way to commit homicide against women and other people in your communities, right? But they found something unexpected here. Wolfgang and Ferracuti, because they were looking at the Philadelphia study, back then there weren't national data sets, were trying to understand why in Philadelphia black women were killing black men at a higher rate. So this is why they said, when you start looking at racial groups, gender doesn't matter. It's about racial dispositions. Because whereas in the white race, men have performed more aggression than women generally, gender doesn't hold as a causative factor in the black race, because black women kill black men with more regularity, at least in Philadelphia. Next slide, please. So what ends up happening then is their student, Menachem Amir, wants to understand, well, then what is the problem specifically with black masculinity? What about it lends it not only to homicide, but aggressive clusters of values that are utilized to define its cultural disposition? Said differently, what is it about being a black male, since you know you can't succeed in society, that makes you take up violence and aggression as part of your being, part of your worldview? Next slide. So Menachem Amir wanted to say, well, look, black masculinity is just naturally pathological. The Negro men's aggressive sexuality seems to be more problematically due to the strong need to overcome problems of masculinity and of sexual identity. This is so because the Negro family structure, which was mother-based, and the need to overcome general social disadvantages by substituting sexual aggressive masculinity for failures as a man in the economic and social status spheres. Next slide. So this means then that black subculture of violence was different than other subcultures because the black subculture created the notion of the interracial rapist. Now, the reason this is so important is because this creates the context by which white feminism started researching patterns of intraracial rape to determine the pathological access of racialized men. So people like Susan Brown Miller, which we'll get to in a second, Williams and Holmes, start understanding questions of patriarchy, not in terms of whether these men actually were patriarchs that had power within their racial groups, but almost solely on the basis of how much violence they committed against the women in their racial groups. Now, this is a huge turn from what previous literature was about, because the myth of the black rapist presupposed that rape was interracial, that black men were threats to white women. throughout colonies. This is the notion of the Black Peril around the turn of the early 1900s that existed in the United States and other Western countries, that the mere contact with Black people would create the conditions where Black men would want to rape white women. But in the mid-1900s, right, in the 20th century, the interracial rapists became the object of study, because these criminologists wanted to say, well, look, there's a natural disposition among racialized men, specifically Black men, to rape their own women. This tells us about the kind of savage values these groups of men have, and how that could serve as the basis of how we understand patriarchy traveling throughout different cultures. So subcultural violence theory then focused on the male rapist, but implicated Black women as the transmitters of this subculture. Again, staying with the same theme of race being pathological. So because all Black people were violent, the idea was that these mothers and their abuse and their sexual mores taught Black men that there was no need to respect the nuclear family. You can see how the arguments about racial savagery and cultural inferiority become a participatory or dynamic within Black communities. Now, these racist criminologists use this as a way to justify not only harsher penalties, but to explain how violence was part and parcel of Black culture. This wasn't just about the rates of violence that were committed. These were arguments that the worldview of Black people were formulated around the need to use violence to compensate for what they could not achieve within society. This, of course, was picked up by white feminists, and this becomes our real central issue today of how we're discussing these kinds of theories being utilized by feminism. So Susan Brown Miller, in Against Her Will, in 1975, explicitly credits Wolfgang and Farah Cootie's work in subcultural violence theory as the basis for her analysis of rape. She writes that Wolfgang's theory, I must oversimplify, is that within the dominant value system of our entire culture, there exists a subculture formed from those of the lower classes, the poor, the disenfranchised, the Black, whose values often run counter to those of the dominant culture, the people in charge. The dominant culture can operate within laws of civility because it has little need to resort to violence to get what it wants. The subculture, thwarted, inarticulate, and angry, is quick to resort to violence. Indeed, violence and physical aggression become a common way of life, particularly for young males. Next slide. So that means that Susan Brown Miller used subcultural violence theory to link masculinity to sexual violence. As she says, we're not talking about Jean Valjean, but the physical aggression as a demonstration of masculinity and toughness. This phrase is Wolfgang's, the prime tenet of subcultural violence, or to use a current phrase, the machismo factor. Allegiance or conformity to machismo, particularly in group or gang, is a sine qua non of status, reputation, identity of the lower class male. Sexual aggression is a major part of machismo. The single most important contribution of Amir's Philadelphia study was to place the rapist squarely within subcultural violence. The rapist, it was revealed, had no separate identifiable pathology aside from the individual quirks and personality disturbances that might characterize any single offender that commits any sort of crime. So even within contemporary works like Bell Hooks, who's utilized as kind of the most authoritative voice on Black males and male violence, you see the same argument. That violence is something that Black men embrace, that because they can't change their circumstances, they choose to become the beast, and that this is common among lower class males. Next slide. She actually understands the violence of poor minority men through the rapists. So when she actually looks at the Central Park 5 crime, which we now know these young men were innocent, she talks about this as if Black men have no value of life, that they're particularly prone to compensate for the lack of economic and educational resources they have, so that we really shouldn't be that surprised that they attack this innocent white woman in jogging in New York or in Central Park. Now, what we have to think about here is the analysis that feminism is giving us of Black men, which in most cases become the object of study in sexual violence. We see this in South Africa. We see this throughout histories of slavery and Jim Crow. And we see that even today when we're talking about things like police violence and police homicide, that Black men are specifically located and isolated as prime subjects of interest. Now, Bell Hooks' analysis has only been accepted, has never been questioned. There's never been any empirical work or studies done to show that these are in fact the attitudes of Black men or any other racialized male group. But in order to separate Black men specifically from the community that they exist in and make masculinity separate from its influence of black femininity or the women of his group, there needed to be another step in the theory. And this is contra-cultural violence theory. So Lynn A. Curtis, who was in charge of the U.S. Housing Department, wanted to suggest that we need a new paradigm in thinking about how black men or racialized men are especially violent. And in order to do this, he wanted to separate the ideas that you get from the dominant group and the subcultural group. He wanted to make a clear distinction. So whereas subcultural violence theory would argue that there's a dominant group, say group A, that had completely separate values than group B, so that you can create a very clear distinction in outgroups. Contra-cultural violence theory wanted to suggest that dominant group values, say like patriarchy, could be bastardized and corrupted by savage or racialized groups. This was called contra-cultural theory. Now, the reason that this distinction is important is because it suggests to us that dominant European values actually predicted or allowed social scientists and criminologists to predict certain rates of violence that's going to happen within racialized or colonized groups. They wanted to understand a paradigm where you can say we can understand excess patriarchy through the ways that savage groups, be they black, Muslim, Latino, etc., misinterpreted what white values were trying to achieve. Under subcultural violence theory, because there are separate values between group A and group B, there is not an option for group A and group B to share the same values. So if you have a value like patriarchy, under a subcultural violence theory, the inferior group cannot be patriarchal. They have distinct values. They're a savage group. They only understand violence. But under a contra-cultural theory, you can have people incorporate patriarchy in a black or Latino community and then misunderstand that, say, as power of men into a very brute thing like the rapist. Next slide. So in Lynn A. Curtis's work, the government, as well as his research, tried to create a different paradigm to understand ghetto culture. In this paradigm, he wanted to understand how race, sex, and class gave different predictive powers to rates of violence that were going to be perpetrated by those communities. So looking at that exist in literature, he wanted to focus specifically on lower class, poor young black males, and why he thought that they occupied a fundamentally different value space than other groups when you look at sex, race, age, and socioeconomic status. In a 3D representation, this is what Curtis was trying to conceptualize. He wanted to understand what is it about racialized men, poor racialized men, that made them uniquely violent to other populations. And what he tried to come up with was kind of a 3D representation of how these groups operate in space and time. So you can say something, for example, that say, well, look, black women are poor and they're subcultural, but they don't have the same potential for violent aggression, homicide, rape, etc., that black men do. And he applied this to all racialized groups, by the way. So he's trying to figure out, well, if we're looking at racial circumstances where there's a dominant group, what is it about this kind of subcultural group that allows them to distort these values and create different forms of violence from that? Next slide. What he found then was that intraracial rape was the best gauge of how we test contra-cultural prevalence. He wanted to say that if you look at racialized men, right, and he's arguing against Susan Griffith here, if you look at racialized men and you look at white men, white male patriarchy is not fundamentally synonymous with rape. So while Griffith can say that white patriarchy utilizes rape and sexual assault as the base of its power, Curtis said, but wait, you don't study, you're not analyzing why there are higher rates of rape in black communities. You're not analyzing why there are higher rates of rape among Spanish-speaking Latino communities. You're not analyzing why there's higher rates of rape in Muslim communities. You see, so ethnicization and racialization then became a way to talk about the pathological access or other sexual violent behaviors that are happening in racialized groups compared to white groups. Next slide. Now, one of the most dangerous parts about this is that these are the exact studies that are being cited by Kimberly Crenshaw under intersectionality. So Crenshaw makes two claims concerning violence in the black community. First, and this is the influence of dominance theory, She believes that women have recognized that the political demands of millions speak more powerfully than the pleas of a few isolated voices. So the politicization has transformed the way we understand violence against women. Battering and rape were thought to be private matters and aberrational, but now they're recognized as part of a broad-scale system of domination that actually affects all women as a class. Her second claim is that by focusing specifically on male violence against women in battering and rape, she considers how the experiences of women of color are frequently deprived of intersecting patterns of racism and sexism. So this is where she's getting kind of the empirical juice for intersectionality. Next slide. So Kimberly Crenshaw wants to understand domestic violence in the Black community as almost solely originating within patriarchy. She has a long response to Shahrazad Ali, who writes the book, The Black Man's Guide to Understanding the Black Woman. And while there's a lot of problems with Ali's book, claims about Black men being natural leaders and part of the natural law, things that have no basis in evidence, there is something that's interesting about it. Towards the end of her book, she tries to explain patterns of violence in the Black community that have previously been unacknowledged by contemporary scholars, specifically Black feminist scholars. Now remember, Ali is not an academic. She's a working class Black woman who interviewed other Black women in her community and wrote a book based on how they experience gender. So Ali says, listen, we have a real issue in our community. Our families and communities are violent. She thinks that that's partly has a large role to do with how Black women treat children and Black men. And she says, look, there are some women in our community that see everything as a fight, be it verbal or physical. Now, Kimberly Crenshaw only cites these kind of segments where she's talking about what Black men should do to defend themselves. She's like, Ali says, shouldn't hit with a closed fist, should slap her, get away, these are this sort, right? Kimberly Crenshaw says this is patriarchy. In fact, Crenshaw goes on to say, look, she says, the problem of violence against women of color is just is not only a manifestation of racism. She says that the relevance of gender domination within the Black community must be reconfigured to think about the role that racism and patriarchy play together. She says that racism is linked to patriarchy to the extent that racism denies men of color power and privilege that dominant men enjoy. When violence is understood as acting out of being denied male power in other spheres, it seems counterproductive to embrace constructs that implicitly link the solution to domestic violence to the acquisition of gender male power, end quote. Now notice how familiar that claim is. That because Black men are denied certain resources, because they're not white men, that they react out violently, right, to compensate for what they don't have. Next slide. This idea, which married criminology and feminist theory, influenced how we thought about racialized men in relationship to their female counterpart. What I really want to import to you here is that we can have all kinds of conversations about gender dynamics within racialized and oppressed communities. But when we have that conversation, we're not really questioning what assumptions are being imported into how we're trying to analyze the situation. What intersectionality brings to the forefront is not a novel conversation about how Black people actually experience domestic violence or various acts of family violence. Because what's happening in Black communities isn't just that men are beating women. It's that men beat women, women are beating women, parents, men and women are beating children, children are beating each other. This notion of family conflict is something that we found throughout epidemiological studies, but rarely encountered when we talk about theory. So we get the impression that when we look into a community, especially an oppressed community, that the primary perpetrators, the origin of all violence, is coming from the men. But when we look at the data, we see something vastly different. And compensatory masculinity was a theory that was introduced into feminist discourses around race by these two authors. And even though they say that there's absolutely no evidence for it, next slide, these things were utilized by Kimberly Crenshaw. So Kimberly Crenshaw makes a statement that Black women, as both women and people of color, are situated within both groups, each of which have benefited from challenges to sexism and racism, and yet the particular dynamics of gender and race relating to the rape of Black women has received scant attention. Now, in a footnote, she says, for example, the use of rape to legitimize efforts to control the discipline the black community is well established in historical literature on rape and race. That's not true. The only book that made that claim is, in fact, Williams and Holmes's book from 1981, which was terribly reviewed. So she quotes this beginning section, which says, rape or the threat of rape is an important tool of social control in a complex system of racial sexual stratification. However, other contemporary accounts make the same view, suggesting that emulation of normative masculinity contributes to heterosexual black men's subordination of women and gays, that black men take pleasure in pleasant hierarchies because they're taught to embrace or try to emulate white men, but no evidence. Frank Rudy Kruger's notion of homophobia and sexism as being posited as compensatory is an ideology. It's what we marry to the idea of black men not having enough resources to make them who they are. There's actually no evidence that black men are more homophobic or sexist than any other group. In fact, empirical studies argue the exact opposite. So that means that we're situating arguments about black men's homophobia and sexism when in fact the research shows that black men are in fact either just as homophobic as black women, and black people are as homophobic or less homophobic than white people, right? That when we do logistical regressions, it doesn't show that masculinity is one of the correlative predictors of homophobia. Things like church attendance are, and education, right? And in fact, some of the more recent studies by Davis and Bryson actually show that religious institution and gender ideology are not significant predictors of anti-gay bias among blacks, but rather competition for political resources may be. Now, all this does is complicate the narrative that we've been utilizing to analyze racialized men the world over. We start with the assumption that black men are homophobic and that they're misogynistic. We start with the assumption that Muslim men are homophobic and misogynistic, right? We start with the assumption that every group of racialized men are in fact bad and threats to other people within their group, despite the fact that evidence that on their attitudes suggests something fundamentally different. So Holmes and Williams suggested that their black men aren't even patriarchs. And then remember, this is what Kimberly Crenshaw used. They're less powerful than they were, but they're less powerless, but they're not powerful. Because the whole system is controlled by white men. So interracial rape then, right? Because we're not talking about actual patriarchy of power, violence, rape becomes the basis by which we're interpreting racialized men as patriarchs. Right? So William and Holmes are very clear about this. They say, look, black females in comparison to Anglo and Mexican Americans are disproportionately victims of rape and all too aware of their vulnerability. In the black community, tension and ambivalence surround the topic of rape. The system of racial sexual stratification has assigned black females to be victims and black males to victimize. Right? And this is important. So when we ask the question, why is it that we make arguments about other groups of men being rapists? Why is that the primary way that we define them? This is why. So intersectionality then becomes very compatible with a system that views racialized men not as being vulnerable to sexual tropes, but in fact fulfilling sexual tropes because of their compensatory nature. Next slide. So the quote that Kimberly Crenshaw actually cites is this. As she admits, it starts off, rape or the threat of rape is an important tool of social control in a complex system of racial sexual stratification. But in a racially sexually stratified society, a high incidence of rape is predictable because rape symbolizes not only a key element of social control working to maintain the system, but also the anger and violence and gender bias system. There is further projection of the white male patriarchy in rape. In raping minority women, minority males frequently are doing no more than imitating the white male, as Curtis suggests. Black on black rape is the symbolic expression of the white male hierarchy, end quote. Now, this is a very powerful quote, right, that I think serves as a real indictment of how Kimberly Crenshaw understands patriarchy being utilized by other racialized minority men. Remember, the idea of a belief system has little to do with how racialized men are actually encountering the world. So when we're analyzing racialized men, when we're looking at any situation, indigenous men, Latino men, black men, etc., we come to the intuitive conclusion that they're violent because we assume that they're the rapist. Now, Kimberly Crenshaw wants to make certain distinctions between interracial rape and intraracial rape, suggesting that intersectionality focuses on intraracial rape, but that is not a unique contribution. As you see here, they've been focused on interracial rape since 1971. Kimberly Crenshaw is writing her arguments in 1989, 1990. So the intersectional lens then recycles subcultural violence theory under the trope of a kind of progressive ideal and utilizes that to frame racialized men fundamentally as deviants. And that's why in our progressive politics, even if you have black men killed by police, they're not fully understood as victims. You also have to talk about the kinds of dangers they pose to women, children, and other sexual minorities in the community. Anytime you're talking about groups of men, for example, what's happening in Palestine, the idea is that they're rapists. So subcultural violence theory then frames our interpretation of how we see racialized men from the outset. And that's considered to be an axiom of gender theory. So racial sexual stratification reinforces subcultural violence norms, despite it saying otherwise. The text that she's quoting from wasn't reviewed very widely or very positively. So the compensatory masculinity became a trope by which we can say things like, if racialized men don't have the power or status of white men, that they're going to use rape and violence as a way to compensate for that. Now, when we look at the actual statistics of intimate partner violence in the black community, there are a few things that jump out to us. The first is that the notion that men use domestic violence as a way to fundamentally oppress women was a product of ideology and selection bias. So Ellen Pence was one of the co-creators of this theory with Michael Piamar. This is called the Duluth model. When she actually develops this theory, there is no clinical support. As she says in this article, this was mostly the basis of their predetermined thinking and jingles. They refused to see other evidence. They refused to have to be able to explain women's violence against their partners, lesbian violence, and the violence of men who did not like what they were doing. So we start with an ideological trope that we know wasn't based in science. Next move. And what we have to figure out, and this is something that I've been working on currently, is how we historically understand black male victimization. So remember, in the black community, we have bidirectional violence. We have situations of family violence where men are beating and battering women, women are battering men, women batter other women, men batter. It goes across the spectrum. There's no segment of any oppressed society in the United States, racialized or minority group, that you're not going to have higher rates of violence overall, both in terms of perpetration and victimization. That is not limited by gender. In the 1980s, Hampton, Gelles, and Harpert said that there have been no papers or analysis on the issue of violence toward black men except the first National Family Violence Survey, which they authored in 1976. And they said that's not surprising given the controversy. They continued, however, that when we were actually looking at rates of homicide, of severe violence toward wives, in black families it was 113 per 100,000, while the rate was 30 per 100,000 in white households. When you looked at black wives, there was twice as likely to engage in severe violence against their husbands, 76 per 1,000, compared to white wives, which is 41 per 1,000, right? So you can see that there's this dynamic of violence that's happening. If you look at this in terms of the rates, you can see that black men were the majority of the victims of homicide from 1976 to 1993. So what this is really showing us is that there's a mythology that's being utilized within feminist politicization of issues of violence against women that not only doesn't align with the data, but is deliberately suggested to be a way to account for the perpetration of racialized men and the dangers they pose to women and children, that serves a political purpose, not a material one, or not one that actually is trying to decrease violence in black communities. In fact, when we actually look at contemporary studies of intimate partner violence and intimate partner homicide, we see that prevalence rates show that black men experience some of the highest rates of 12-month prevalence. They experience domestic violence in a 12-month cycle slightly above that of their female counterpart. When we're looking at NISVS data from 2010 and 2011, you see the same thing. Nobody is arguing, or nobody could argue, that black female victimization isn't higher than its white counterpart. That's what this chart shows. Next slide. But the same thing holds true for every racialized male group in the United States, right? So think about it this way. You have a politicization of gender-based violence, but the data is consistently showing not only do men and women of racialized minority groups have comparable rates of violence between themselves, but all those groups experience more violence than white women do, for example. And none of our conceptual lenses or apparati actually have something to say about that. Next slide. The most recent data shows the exact same thing. Not only does it show disproportionate rates of lifetime and 12-month prevalence, next slide, you actually see among black men here that they actually have 56.7, one of the first times that their lifetime prevalence of domestic violence actually outstripped that of their female counterpart. We see the same thing with rape and sexual violence in the black community. We not only have high rates of statutory rape among black boys, that was common during segregation, but we also find that they're more likely to experience completed sexual violations than their female counterparts. Across the board, sexual assault among black men and boys becomes the basis of disowning victimization. We've tried to create caricatures of what the black community actually exists as, and that's because we've fallen into an ideology of feminism that disregards empiricism. We have no way to actually talk about how black men and boys suffer within these regimes of cyclical violence, but rather we like to just claim them as being the originators and sole perpetrators of that violence. So when you're looking at things like statutory rape, sexual assault, next slide, or even how the CDC reclassified rape in 2012 and what it means now for made to penetrate violence, you have high levels of sexual vulnerability against men. Now, we found the same thing when we were looking at studies of racialized boys in South Africa. So this is not an isolated problem. This is a problem that suggests that with any kind of colonial or economic or racially repressed regime, you're going to find high levels of male sexual victimization. Feminism doesn't track that. Intersectionality, in fact, disowns that fact to prefer this notion of the black male perpetrator, that all men trying to gain power over women are going to perform sexual violence and rape to achieve that end. So as I said, when we're looking at that system, progressive politics then is able to gather that kind of disdain and that articulation to say that even in the midst of fighting for the rights of oppressed people, you still have to watch out for the men and boys within their society. And again, none of this actually meshes with the data. We of course see disproportionate rates, next slide. We of course see disproportionate rates of women, black women that have contact sexual violence. But as you see on the next slide, you have extremely high rates of contact sexual violence where black men are victimized as well. Okay? So it fundamentally changes the way that intersectionality has to account for female violence. And feminism continues to deny female perpetration, which becomes the problem. Yeah, we can start there. So really quickly, I just want to frame two things. The historical claims by intersectionality and contemporary feminist ideas want to situate us within a toxic culture of patriarchy and male privilege. The rendering of Title VII that Kimberly Crenshaw gives us suggested that race was focused on protecting men and gender was focused on protecting white women. That theory is actually partially correct. When we actually looked at the congressional records of Title VII legislation, we find a few things. The first thing we find is that black men were not really discussed. Race represented black women because the debates in Congress were over whether or not black women were going to be hired for jobs under Title VII and white women would not have the right to sue. The debates completely centered on adding sex to Title VII as the basis of giving white women the right to sue and get job preference over black women. Next slide. This meant that the addition of Title VII legislation was meant to secure the rights of white women to be hired over black women and be empowered to do so over anti-discrimination laws. This makes sense in the current environment that we have, despite the claims of intersectionality, given that we just banned affirmative action and we banned race-based affirmative action and left gender-based affirmative action untouched. Now, the redistribution of resources meant that you were in fact trying to create populations that would not have economic or educational opportunity. And this is how feminism is fundamentally linked to one another. In the 1970s, feminism endorsed a view that said poor underclass black men who didn't have education or economic resources were going to become violent. Title VII debates in the early 1970s that were trying to push this forward, right, said, well, look, we need to redistribute goods so that the black race would have the same opportunities that the white race had. White women said, absolutely not, because we will not live in a world where black women or black people have more rights for education or jobs than white women did. Next slide. So through Title VII legislation, they gave all the protections that were supposed to be afforded to black people to white women. And they literally, I urge you to read that quote really quickly. They thought that racial advance would disadvantage white women. So by creating a system where the law said that you couldn't give economic or educational opportunities exclusively to black people, they created the very same black men they were claiming were going to be the threats that they saw in the early 1970s. Because if the issues of subclass or underclass of black people that didn't have any kind of access to social mobility, through Title VII legislation, adding sex and draining those resources to white women allowed them to maintain that black people would stay an economic and cultural underclass. Now, despite the fact that this is how Title VII jurisprudence actually develops, intersectionality makes no mention whatsoever of the debates that white feminist organizations like NOW had in adding sex to Title VII. She merely claims that it's a reflection of white women's interests and racist black women's interests. But as you can see, the competition for white women's economic and educational interests were not geared towards black men, they were geared towards black women. So in the further readings, a few different places, I come up with a different system for articulating this. The first thing is, look, in the Man Not, I show that given this empirical evidence, we need to completely rethink patriarchy. So we can no longer just say intersectionality is the answer to how we want to deal with race questions. There's too much at stake. The evidence does not support that claim. Intersectionality is a system compatible with the ways that white supremacist jurisprudence assumed black people operated and how black men were perpetrators. It's compatible with that idea that feminism is introducing about women as a class being victims of sexual violence and battery, right? Second, because we haven't questioned this, it means we've adopted a view of feminism that's very much an apparatus of neocolonial thinking. And I want to be very clear. Colonial thinking said that the barbarism of black men, of racialized men, justified interventions and imperialism to civilize the race and save the women and children of those groups. Intersectionality makes the same claim, that due to feminism being resisted within black communities have not civilized themselves to question patriarchy, the savagery of their men, and requires feminism and a liberal ethic to do so. That's what Mapping the Margin says. So we keep the same view of the black community as being fundamentally pathological. We keep the same view of the brown community being fundamentally pathological and hypermasculine. We have the same idea of the Muslim community, of the African communities. These are not white men, they're from the global south, hence they're compensating. That's why you have high rates of violence. But intersectionality does not give us an answer to that. It tries to re-extend criminological theories as a way to contain and diagnose what it takes to be the errant and pathological masculinity of these racialized men and boys. This claim that we can simply apply it across the board, that this can be the language of our movements, overlooks the tremendous failure of BLM. Remember, Black Lives Matter came out as a movement allegedly against police violence. Very quickly, it had to shift to groups that didn't create as much threat or didn't pose as much of a threat in the minds of whites. So we talked about women and sexual minorities, despite the fact that they make up an extremely small percentage, in some cases less than 5% of the people, that the black people actually killed by police violence. So intersectionality still maintains this kind of essential trope of the dangerous black male. Next slide, please. We also now know that given the research on black female perpetrated sexual assault and black male sexual assault, that the issues of violence within racialized communities are much more complex, right? That doesn't mean that we just walk around and dismiss claims of female victimization, because as you saw from the data, we can see that. But it means that we have to fundamentally rethink what we're trying to do when we're claiming that we're trying to protect women and children from the ideas of the savage racialized male. These things are codified in theory. History is saturated with feminist literature, suffragette literature, claiming that there's a barbaric tendency on the part of black men and other non-white groups. In fact, suffragists were so secure of this fact that they insisted that they should only be ruled by the best groups of men in the world, which were white men. So we're making mistakes and we're making ahistorical claims, and we're trying to suggest that feminism was in fact antagonistic to patriarchy. Feminism just wanted to be ruled and compatible with the most developed form of patriarchy, which was held by Anglo-Saxons at that time. That means that from the period of time, the 1800s to our contemporary day, racialized men have therefore they've took on the brunt of these stereotypes of racism, violence, sexual aggression, etc., that's been associated with non-white groupings, right? Next slide. I document all this in an article on Feminism as Racist Backlash, because what I wanted to show was that this is not an issue of feminism it's not an issue of feminism being bankrupt. It's an issue of the very roots of feminism already having a predetermined goal. Feminism throughout its history has always targeted racialized men as savage and has endorsed and built theories around that. So anytime we deploy this lens, we can't be surprised that racialized men come out looking like perpetrators of rape, sexual violence, pedophilia, pick your poison. The notion of the terrorist works side by side with the notion of the rapist. The notion of the black criminal and deviant is the same thing that works alongside the domestic abuser. These tropes of analysis of racialized men do not go deeper than the initial tropes that were situated in the 1880s. Why we keep endorsing this view, why we can't see then this clear connection between a perpetrator lens of racialized men and the notion that women and children are always in danger from that is beyond me. Every piece of evidence that Kimberly Crenshaw cites herself, as well as contemporary discussions, show that's what the predetermined assumptions were. So I think our task right now then is to understand how feminism, even intersectional feminism, keeps perpetuating this imperial trope. How it tries to justify liberal intervention, capitalist intervention, or even the intervention of government into colonized populations and oppressed populations, all based on the trope that the men are dangerous and the women are then vulnerable. Next slide. So I'll end it there. Many of the conversations that happen in the United States around this issue are not just hostile, but they're based in they're really rooted in censorship. Right? You're not really allowed to question, you're not really allowed to point out this empirical gap within the intersectional literature. When we talk about any form of violence against men, it's supposed to only be descriptive. The U.S. Academy works with the idea that every group of men who are not white perpetuate violence, almost pathologically. And there's very little evidence for this claim. But it is part of the trope that exists in terms of how we study black masculinity and other forms of outgroup men. And it's not just a form of academic bigotry, but it's almost a necessary component of being hired and well placed in the United States. For over 20 years, there's not been a single empirical substantiation of any of these claims, be it compensatory masculinity, toxic masculinity, etc. The idea that black men are violent, the idea that non-white men are fundamentally tyrannical is just what we see as a function of imperialism and our dominant polemic. And anytime you try to show that intersectionality perpetuates rather than questions that, there's a harsh rebuke, not with evidence, but simply with the idea that intersectionality has to stand alone. So whereas black people constantly are put in a situation that they have to think about their liberation, they have to analyze the way the empire is expanding, that they have to look at their deaths, the Liberal Academy says no new ideas can come about. Intersectionality is your answer. So in many ways, it is not intersectionality as a system that has won the day. It is the white liberal endorsement of intersectionality that refuses any publication of any critical engagement with the theory or the pointing out of its colonial origins and its criminological theories or endorsements that allows it to thrive, right? It silences criticism, and for many people, this now becomes kind of a Bible, so to speak. The idea is that all racialized men are violent, that they use rape to imitate patriarchy, and that they have to be dealt with first and foremost. So even with their deaths, like in BLM, what I think we see now in Gaza, how all these men get killed, the center is always going to be on women and children first. Right? Deaths of racialized men don't matter because they bear the ultimate sin of being antisocial and unassimilatable to the dominant Western societies. So I'll open up for questions.
Thank you so much for that amazing lecture. So we have a few questions of our own prepared, and then we're going to open it for the audience. So allow us to start on a critical note and get maybe some preconceptions out of the way, or some critical ideas that some of us could have in the back of our mind throughout all of this discussion. So as much as your research and the field of Black male studies unravel colonial narrations on the Black man and gender or any social dynamics in the Black community or any colonized communities in general, couldn't this academic approach be understood to be either an attempt or indirectly leading to the covering up or at least downplaying of patriarchal violence and structures in the communities, which we unfortunately do have in every single community?
Yeah, I guess my work would ask, how would we identify the patriarchal violence? Because if you use domestic violence and rape and say that is patriarchal violence, then I would ask, well, then why is it that Black men are subject to patriarchal violence at the hands of women, Why are black boys subject to patriarchal violence at the hands of mothers, etc.? I'm trying to show that the violence runs throughout the community, that we have sexual assault at actual and statutory rape of black boys and black girls. We have abuse of black women and black men. It exists that way in every community. So what we call patriarchal violence, I'm not downplaying whatsoever, but I am saying that the causal assumption that it's only patriarchy and it's only men that participate in this violence is fundamentally wrong and plays at a larger politicized notion of demonizing the race rather than actually improving the conditions within the racial or ethnic group.
Thank you. I have a few quotes from the epilogue of your book.
Oh no.
Okay. No, it's really interesting. You summarize a lot in it. You write about the censorship in academia. So let me just quote a few sentences. This censorship of scholarship, dealing with black men and boys, both demonstrates and reinforces the unquestioned racist misandry at work within disciplines. While white male and female authors are thought to serve as a theoretical guides for various racial projects, regardless of their personal and historical racism, and they can even become sociologically interesting when they realize and own their white privilege, black males who remain oppressed and largely absent from the academy as students and professors are considered pariahs when they are centered as victims. While journals, college lectures, and books remain dedicated to and composed of endless engagements with white men who supported slavery and believed in black inferiority, as well as white women who conspired alongside the mythology of the black rapist and held black people to be of a savage kind, it is only the writing about black men and boys that is censored and deliberately prevented from being conceptually engaged. Exactly. And so you write about this censorship. And you yourself come from a black radical tradition, but from what we have seen, you represent a tiny minority in academia, or at least in Western academia of this century. So having worked a lot on the subject of pacification and co-optation of radical activism here and liberation movements, including by academia, we understand academia to be a tool of the state. And so coming from that, what is your experience with that co-optation especially by radical academics like Fanon, for example, is
listen,
debate.
I think all black male academics suffer from accusations of sexism, misogyny, even Fanon. There was always this idea that you're against somebody. So if you're a black radical, you hate white people. If you're critical of feminism, you hate women, right? It's driven by the presumption of hatred and anti-sociality. The universities in the United States operate in such a way that someone like a Bell Hooks, who writes about black men being criminals, violence, abusers, and rapists, despite having a scholarly apparatus, and by that I mean no citations or verifiability of the claims, is celebrated. It speaks to how white liberals think about the black race. If you're a black radical, and it doesn't have to even be about gender, right? But if you're a black radical who talks about democracy being fundamentally rooted to its colonial imperial origins, right? I mean, Gerald Horne's work about, the Declaration of Independence really been about owning slaves, not this, right? Derek Bell, somebody that I knew and wrote my dissertation on, the society and academia rejected, right? And people have paid extremely high prices for disagreeing with this idea that we've moved to this kind of racial amelioration. Even with what's going on in the United States now, there are scholars who are making their careers saying, look, we should have optimism. There should be hope with all the people that are dying. And those people are at Ivy League institutions. So my experience with that was just very clear that this is not about the amount of research that you do or the number of awards that you win. This is about maintaining a certain kind of ideology that says that black people are not fundamentally oppressed and that racism can be overcome given the benevolent values of white people. I will never say that. So admit that I had to be creative about how I understood my academic career. So I look to Canada, I look to the UK, where I would have more freedom to actually do the kinds of serious research I wanted to do. And once I stepped kind of on those campuses, there wasn't a question of whether or not it was qualified or good research. You know, they did their little rigorous evaluation of my work, and they said, okay, well, this is good. Let's go with this. You know, let's hire them. So that taught me a few things. It taught me that Black academics both are socialized to criticize white supremacy, and they're socialized to expect acceptance from the white people they criticize. And that's the dynamic. It's that Black academics are appealing for the crumbs of the white academic liberal establishment because they think that's their audience. My perspective was, largely because of intellectual history, there have to be other white people to talk to. There has to be scholars of the global South that's willing to talk to me, right, about these issues. And once I started presenting internationally, right, it's talking to people in Africa, different people throughout Europe, etc., I recognized that much of the resistance to the Black radical tradition existed as the political situation in the United States and the socialization, because you have hostility, you know, in Europe towards radical Black thought, but you have people who really do accept, understand, and learn from radical Black thought. They think there's something that radical Black thinkers and radical Black males have to teach the world about resistance. That's not the case in the United States. And I think that you see evidence of that not only with what's going on right now on college campuses, like the illusion that people thought they had with academic freedom with the protests and support for Palestine, but I also think you see examples of that around BLM. Because when BLM came out, the white establishment said we endorse it, and Black scholars fell in line. They didn't criticize a movement that was supposed to be about their own people. So Black academic freedom in the United States is very much contingent on the interests and the ideas that the white majority have about what Black people should say. And now that you have a situation where you have not only Black people, but various groups of whites and other you know, Palestinians, and you know, you have some radical Jewish students there and professors, like, and Christians, you know, you have a whole company of people that are protesting the attack. And so you see how universities are cracking down on free speech to preserve their dominant interests. Now, when this happened around when I was attacked by the alt-right at Texas A&M, they suggested that the silence of the Black academics were particular, just to the most radical academics, right? But as you can see, this is part of the apparatus. And then you have to ask yourself this fundamental question. In a world where all radical thoughts being attacked, where's intersectionality in this, right? Where's these same kind of powerful criticisms? Where's BLM in this? See, those things disappeared because they weren't really about the reformulation of system or people's ways of thinking. They were very much contextual to the moment. How can we get the money and support for this? Because white people felt real generous after George Floyd. But when you're actually talking about organizing, or what I'm more interested in, which is creating a particular school of thought that teaches generations how to think about these issues versus this kind of old regime, that's not what's being pushed. You're not getting that from the top institutions. You're certainly not getting that from the Ivy Leagues, right? The Global South is a gesture that many Black academics have, but it's performative. Because when you actually talk about how violence operates in the Global South, and that's not, and you know, it's not the politicized violence they want to talk about. It's not just women and children, because you're talking about diseases. You're talking about hunger, starvation, pollution, natural disasters. Our way of thinking doesn't fit within that model of trying to situate, right, the nations and colonies on the periphery, and the way that is situated in relationship to the West, specifically the EU, right? That's not the conversation Americans are having, and I think it's to our detriment because we see evidence after evidence that shows that white nationalism, specifically white ethno-nationalism, is at the forefront of how what we think and what we can say becomes determined by the interest of a small minority of white nations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. You touched on this already, but we constantly see revivals of the subject of men, masculinity, and patriarchal violence during times of colonial warmongering. But in the last years, it seems to take on a specific quality. In your research on the systemic negation of the suffering of Black people in the US, with their simultaneous demonization, have you recognized any parallels, which you did, to anti-Muslim racism or Islamophobia, but especially towards like the fighting Muslim, the mujahid, also the fighting Arab man? So
no, absolutely.
Elaborate on that.
Yeah, absolutely I can. I mean, you know, a lot of my research is based on how racialized male groups are constructed as threats. So in the book that I'm working on now, I have a large section on how the Arab man is viewed as a terrorist and a threat to Western society. Uh, these this is just a general phenomenon across how Western societies, Western capitalistic societies, view or construct or enforce racism. So to create we don't talk in these terms anymore, so it becomes very different. When we talk about racism now, we talk about discrimination, we talk about privilege, etc. That really gets us away from one of the primary designations of racism, which are in groups and out groups. So regardless of the kind of oppression that we see or marginalization you see among other white minorities, they don't commit genocide against their own group. Right? When we talk about genocides, wars, imperial conquest, etc., those are groups who are deemed to be not like them. And it's in this relationship between out-group status and dehumanization that we find the racialized male. Because within all of these characterizations of how we conduct warfare, our genocide, our dehumanized caricatures, right, propaganda of other groups, the male becomes the indicator of the threat it poses to the dominant group. So in the United States, we see that when we talk about, right, Mexican men, right, this is with Trump, Mexican men are coming over raping women, right? We see this in terms of conversations with black crime, the black criminal and deviant, right? We see this in conversations with the Muslim man is a terrorist. The male becomes the indication or symbol of the threat the outgroup race or the subordinate race poses to the dominant group. So the work that I'm doing on black men isn't just about how are these things similar. I'm arguing that these are products of the very same kinds of patterns. That the same thing that you're seeing with Kimberly Crenshaw's endorsement of subcultural violence theory is just part of the apparatus of how racialized men are situated as violent and aggressive naturally. Remember, Lynn A. Curtis is making the argument that white patriarchy has its problems, but whites live in a civil society where violence and values of violence aren't the predominant values. Whereas they're arguing that black people and other racial minorities operate in cultures where violence becomes the tone and tenor of how they communicate and express their existence as a symbol of their being to the world. This kind of difference and dichotomy between the two are part and parcel of how racialized men are situated within Western patriarchal societies. So that's why I said to the earlier question, we really have to rethink what we mean about patriarchal violence. Because when we talk about how white Christian nations demonize Muslim men and Islam, is that a form of patriarchal violence? Does it suggest that the Christian man is in fact the epitome of what God intended to rule? And then is that not the basis, right, the political economy, philosophical anthropology of Christianity that dictates part of the antagonism, if not all the antagonism towards Islam, right? These notions originate in a paradigm and a hierarchy of being that's created in the West and is epitomized within Western nations. When we start studying how Africans, Muslims, Arab peoples, et cetera, are located in relationship to the dominant metropole, it becomes incumbent on us to understand how they're articulating threats. And that's something that we don't really want to admit because it runs against our traditional feminist paradigms. Right? If you're almost mandated to say women and girls suffer the most every single time, then how do you explain the overdiagnosis or the overdetermination of young Muslim boys as terrorists? Right? Of practically every combat age man in Palestine, part of Hamas, right? These are all, the New York Times article that was, written about this. Like, these are all part and parcel of how, what I argue in my work, misandric aggression operates. Patriarchy is a kinship system. So that means that it extends itself and tries to take care of people in its own racial or ethnic group. So it may marginalize its women, but it doesn't exterminate them. People outside the kinship group get exterminated. And that's what we're dealing with. We're not just dealing with a discrimination against black men. We're dealing with a particular misandric characterization that often manifests itself in terms of violence and lethal violence especially, that is used to keep outside groups in order and in line.
It's quite on point. How does academia specifically deal with the oppression of black men, black people in the US in general? Everything that they face, from slave labor and mass imprisonment to fatal police violence. And how does the historiography differ hear from people closer to a white European identity, such as the way genocide studies deal with black subjects versus Jewish and Armenian people, for example.
Yeah, I mean, Africa becomes a topic of study in genocide study scholarship. There are a few people who, like Dan Stone's work, that tries to link the colonial endeavor with, like the Holocaust or the Armenian genocide. But his work, while well cited, I don't think is the majority view. Racialization doesn't become one of the major aspects of looking at genocides generally, in my experience. But what I think is interesting is that black people are told that the problems of racism and lethal violence are something that we have to appeal to the white majority to solve. Whereas when you deal with historical groups like Jews or Armenians, there's a limit to what they have to accept as the basis of reconciliation given what happened to their people. So black people are not allowed that kind of self-determination, right? They're lumped in with the perpetually begging group, so to speak, always on hand and need, asking white societies to respect their humanity and to not kill them. Other groups are studied with a full respect of the kinds of tragedy and trauma that was created by other groups on their people. And black people are being told, well, you should, like in the United States, well, we're done talking about race. We're not going to have that conversation anymore. It's no longer a factor. No one would tell Armenian people or Jewish people that that's the case, right? They have a right to their collective memory. So black people negotiate that in terms of social mobility. And that's one of the things that I argued in chapter 3 of the book, is that these ideas are not useful because they're true. They're useful because they serve as a certain indicator of politics to white liberals. It's the same way if you call yourself an African American or a Black American, right? If you endorse feminism, intersectionality, liberalism, these are markers of social mobility and uplift. Because these theories have been shown to be false time and time again. It's almost as if black academics are forced to be, proselytizers, right? We have to go out and spread the good word that the world's gonna somehow do better, and it doesn't. So the failure of that means that black people have to constantly ask for recognition, whereas other groups simply get it. And I think that's one of the downfalls of the move towards kind of speculative metaphysics. So you can, I know Afro-pessimism is really popular, and you kind of have In the Wake, etc. But these are interpretive tools of how we're thinking about black suffering. They're not the diagnosis of power or studying the effectivity of white desire and motivation to exterminate different groups of people that look different than them. And that's what's out of line here. We don't want to somehow study our oppressor. We want to keep putting the burden of proof on the oppressed to somehow be better, even though they're under the same oppressive conditions that they started off with. And I actually learned this when I was doing my fellowship at USC, because when I started going through some of the Holocaust literature and research, and found out that Jewish men were raped during the Holocaust, there was this idea that, well, look, even if these Jewish men or women committed violence against each other, that's not their natural condition, right? That's not their natural condition because they're oppressed. Now you transpose that same assumption to black people, to Palestinians, to any other group of people, and their argument is they're naturally violent. See, so the thing is that we've accepted as the basis of theory, be it intersectionality, be it liberalism, be it whatever progressive black politics you want, we've accepted that the actions that black people are enduring to suffer and perform under the most severe conditions of oppression, homicide, murder, and legal subjugation is part of their nature. But every other group of people suggests these are accidents because it's just the conditions and the environment that you put them in. So the question is, why do we do that? Why do we assume that what happens to the poorest, the most brutalized, the most disenfranchised is an indication of black masculinity? There's no white group that says, hey, we were poor, we were starving, we're on the brink of a genocide or a famine. So whatever we did, that's part of who we really are. You see, we black people and black men especially don't have the meter of brutality. They're never pushed to the edge. They only fulfill this kind of ontological purpose or claim that they're assumed to be born with, which is violence. And this is really the heritage of bell hooks that says that all black men are violent, right? Like all men, black men are violent. They commit violence for the same reason. These axioms have defined how we approach and study every racialized group of men and boys without any real warrant as to why we believe that. And anytime you introduce sociological evidence or historical fact and contextualization, it's rejected for the axiom. These men are already violent. So no, the fact that mothers are beating these little black boys, that has nothing to do with them being men. The fact that they're being brutalized and exposed to violence and seeing people get shot in front of them at the age 6, that has nothing to do with how they view violence or relationships. You see, you take away all the sociality of what they go through, and then you arrive at the pre-concluded notion or the pre-discernible notion that these men are violent. You don't do that for other groups, right? So the way that we treat these is because we see humanity in white European groups. Even white thinkers like Heidegger, he's a Nazi. And we still see value in his work. But let you talk about Fanon. Oh, he's a misogynist. Oh, let's talk about Du Bois. He didn't include women. Let's talk about Curry. Oh, he questions feminism. Right? So black men have less freedom to think about themselves as full subjects of study compared to these other groups of people. And I think that's why the analysis looks so different.
Thank you. Thank you again. Now let's open the question around to the audience. Does anyone have any questions?
I originally wanted to ask about, because intersectionality for me feels like it's an inner policy thing, like it's maintaining demographics and something like that. I originally wanted to ask how it projects on foreign policy, but I think you tied it up really well at the end. So instead, I wanted to ask about whether you have some input on. Now we had like sexual violence as a factor or indicator, and then we had like physical violence, police killings. But what about the administrative side of things, like black men in particular are clearly administered by the state. This is clear state violence into like being funneled to the prison system to be maintained as a slave population.
Yes.
Well, the question is just whether you have input on that aspect.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't talk about it so much as under intersectionality, but it is a form of misandric aggression. In the 1970s, Stewart and Scott wrote an article about institutional decimation, where they suggested that one of the major empirical or observable phenomena of American racism was the decimation of male population. That was either through homicide or institutionalization or incarceration. So we see that phenomenon continuing. I mean, a few years ago, the New York Times released an article saying that 1.5 million black men between the ages of 24 and 35 were removed from the population, either from premature homicide or incarceration. So we can see that there are population level effects happening with the ways that racism is enforced in the United States. Intersectionality has responded to this by basically suggesting that the focus on black men as being more endangered than their female counterpart, because they experience higher rates of incarceration, higher rates of unemployment, higher rates of downward mobility, and higher rates of premature homicide, either at the hands of police or others, compared to black women, that they're doing so bad that to focus on their disadvantages erases black women. So much of the arguments and research now simply says whatever's happening to black men is kind of and it doesn't indicate anything about their higher risk towards or endangerment by racism. I just completely reject that argument. I think it's nonsensical and it's something that does not apply to any other group of people. So if you look at it, like even when you looked at COVID, you said X number of people are suffering, that becomes a population you're trying to deal with. Intersectionality, specifically the notion of intersectional visibility, says, well, black men could be the most endangered, but we have a moral responsibility not to endorse the fact that they're more endangered. And that's how much of the scholars, so people like Shamita Threadcraft, I think she's at Vanderbilt now, she explicitly makes this argument, saying that if we focus on black male incarceration, it takes away attention from black women suffering in the private. Now, she presents no evidence for this. There's no barometer or measurement of this at-large attention. But this is what's being kind of promulgated in the United States as cutting-edge black feminist theory. So the part of the argument is you cannot focus on men and boys. And that's run through various disciplines. And any focus on that is necessarily oppressive to other groups because you trade off in recognition. So we've reached a point, and to me this just indicates how little power black people have in America, that now you have to argue about who's killed more. That literally, the argument is you can't focus on black men being killed more because it trades off recognition. Not resources, not policy, not actual things that are going to improve recognition. So that's the way that these arguments about gender and incarceration and murder actually happen within the culture of the United States right now.
Any other questions?
It is crystal clear.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on everything that I had questions on. So, yeah.
It's time. You've been talking for like quite a while already.
No, please.
I know you're in the UK for a couple of years now,
Mm-hmm.
and like, for obvious reasons, I understand a lot of your analysis is rooted in the kind of experience in the US.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious just how much you think it extrapolates to other populations
Mhm.
or other groups. I mean, a lot of people would see a significant difference between kind of the experience of black communities in the UK compared to the US experience, but then you have the circulation of theory where theory produced in the US academia does tend to filter through
Yeah.
everyone else. So,
Yeah.
and I think there's often not enough kind of critique of to what extent theory produced in that very particular context
Mm-hmm.
applies at all, either to black communities in the UK as a narrow example,
Mm-hmm.
or like you've made reference to other groups internationally. So
Yes.
do you see it sort of carrying over?
Absolutely.
Or
I mean, I think a few things have to be said there. One, I tried to, this presentation, I really wanted to clarify the particular mechanisms that I thought intersectionality brought to continuing the same kind of stereotypes that we saw in the colonial age. And because intersectionality has been exported to so many Western nations, that interpretive lens becomes the basis of them reading places like Africa, the situation of disproportionate incarceration in London, for instance, and underperformance of black boys compared to white boys, in the South. So I think it's relevant, but I think that it's overdetermined because what I found is, even places like Oxford or even Edinburgh, you have these people that are endorsing intersectionality, but the UK doesn't keep the same kind of disaggregated data that America does, so you can't even test it. So it becomes this kind of predetermined assumption. I remember I was having a conversation with the Scottish government, and they were saying, "Oh, well, what's your view of intersectionality?" Because they were working on some data. I said, "Well, you have to test every interaction." I was like, "You're working with the presumption that minority women are going to be at the bottom." I was like, "But all the empirical tests of a race, gender, or race, gender, class interaction within Western societies come up to the opposite effect. It's migrant men usually who experience the highest forms of discrimination, etc." So of course they didn't, call me back after that conversation, but it's because of these issues, right? Like there's no girth or substance to the claim. Like you're basically taking data in the UK because it's not well organized, and you're coming to you're disaggregating. You're trying to find such a small group to make your point. You in every report, even the COVID report, you'll see like the data says that poor Bangladeshi and black men had the highest rates of mortality, but the report was saying, well, black women and girls are most affected. And it doesn't match up with the data. It's just the ideology. So that interpretive lens has tremendous effect for how we both perceive and deal with racial circumstances in the UK and Europe. In terms of the actual conditions, I find a few things. I find the UK extremely consistent with a class analysis that doesn't account for any of the racial disaggregation effects. So if you look at housing discrimination, you find poor white people, in the UK living in terrible housing, and then educated middle-class black and brown people still living in those same neighborhoods. So there's an effect of discrimination that's not being announced. And when I went to Belgium to talk to them about some of the findings of the EU Commission on race and racial profiling, all the numbers suggest that the EU is an extremely racist place. That black, specifically African migrants, have a very hard time both in terms of getting access to services and hostility generally from the population, especially the police. But they had no conceptualization of that, and in fact said, well, we don't really collect data outside of what we send to the EU Commission on Race and Racism. So you have a situation where, yeah, American theory is completely overdetermined, not completely accurate given the context. On the other hand, you have the underdevelopment of theory because there's not a utilization and politicization of racially disaggregated data to see the effects that racism has in European societies, while you systematically disown it and say it's colorblind, right? So what's being picked up then is a view of American theories that become de-radicalized, de-racialized, and something that tries to fit within kind of European academies being cutting edge, but not really addressing anti-black racism or the particular substantiations of the legacies of colonialism. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
Anything else? Or I guess we've been speaking for over 2.5 hours.
Oh, okay. It went by quickly.
No, it was, honestly, thank you so much for your time.
No, you're quite welcome.
Thank you for flying in from Edinburgh. And yes, thank you all for listening as well.